Chapter 32. The Dirty Sixties. America starts its slide down the toilet hole. On January 9, 1960, Vice President Richard Nixon declared his candidacy for president, and on the 31st of January, Senator John Kennedy announced his intentions to make a run for it. They both received their party's endorsements, and the battle was on. On February 17, Negro leader Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia on a charge of perjury in the Alabama bus boycott. There was much racial unrest across the southern states, and it looked like big trouble was brewing. The year of 1960 proved to be a productive one for the Jarrett clan. To get the year started, a new baby girl was born to Bob and Joyce on Monday, January 11, and was named Christy Ann. On Tuesday, March 1, 1960, Yo and Shirley produced a new little girl into the growing Jarrett clan. Her name was Tina Marie. 5 days later, a little boy was added to the growing clan. His name was Timothy Davis Arnold. His birth date was Sunday, March 6, 1960. I was beginning to wish more and more that I had a profession that not just anyone could walk in off the street and do. Something that would not require a lot of capital or education. I wasn't interested in a college degree that would require 4 years and would still leave me with someone looking over my shoulder. And besides that, I've already been there and done that. Remember back in 1940, however, right at the moment I wasn't looking for anything permanent, just something that would put some groceries on the table and keep the wolves away from the door. I didn't miss a paycheck. The following day I went to work at Jim and Bill's truck stop at San Antonio, Mo. Jim Booman was no longer there. He had made a little nest egg and decided to enroll in the University of South Dakota to obtain a degree in mathematics. He would eventually get his degree and spend the next 35 years teaching high school mathematics in Long Beach, California. My job consisted of gassing up cars and trucks, doing grease jobs and oil changes, and changing and repairing auto and truck tires. One day out of the clear blue, a representative from the Veterans Administration came by the truck stop and wanted to talk to me. He informed me that I was still eligible for 6 more months of training, and wanted to know if there was anything that I would like to pursue. I inquired as to what was available, and he named several things. It was then that I remembered, Billy Frank had mentioned to me from time to time that I ought to go to Barber College. I asked the fellow if that was available, and he said that it was. Maureen and I discussed it, and that weekend Billy Frank and Francis came up. He thought I should do it, and said that he would go with me and introduce me to the people there, and I could have a look around. A few days later we went to Kansas City, and Bill and I went over to the Barber College, located in the heart of downtown Kansas City, in the 900 block of Main Street. I met with the school officials, and toured the facility, and Bill convinced me that it would be a good profession to go into. They told me that their classes were all full, but there would be a new class, beginning the first day of November, 1960, so I made arrangements to attend. We decided to take a shorter trip this year, so at 2:15, in the afternoon, on Tuesday, June 14, we headed down Highway 71. Our destination was Morin's Uncle Frank and Aunt Geneva Bunce's, at Knoll, Missouri. They had recently retired and moved there. Jimmy was nearly 7, and Gary was 5.5. This was in the days just before interstate highways, and Highway 71 passed through downtown Kansas City, from one end to the other. It was a time-consuming route, with many stoplights, and a lot of traffic. We stopped at the little town of Sheldon, Mo, and dined in the city park. We were about 180 miles from home. From there we drove another hour to the town of Lamar, where we spent the night in a motel. It cost us $6.12. We arose the following morning and drove down the highway to Jasper, and had breakfast in the city park. We had our trusty old cooler chest along, and it was chock full of bacon, and eggs, and other goodies. We arrived at Uncle Frank's at 10 a.m. Their home was on the Elk River, at the site of a waterfall. The old mill where they ground meal back in the old days was still standing, and we sat in chairs and fished from the window openings. The river flowed out of the Grand Lake of the Cherokees, in Oklahoma. It was a beautiful place, and we sure enjoyed ourselves. We spent the night at their house, and had breakfast with them, and did a little more fishing, and playing in the water. After dinner we bid them farewell and headed out for Roaring River State Park. It was about 50 miles east on State Route 90, that curved around through the Ozark Mountains. We got to our destination at 4 o'clock, and I set up the tent. During the night, we could hear all kinds of wild animals and birds. We had never heard anything like it before, or since. It also got pretty cold during the night, and we nearly froze. The following day we played in the water and fished a little, and it was a great place to camp. We left in the afternoon at 4 o'clock, and traveled up State Highway 60 and 54, to Camdenton, on the Lake of the Ozarks. We arrived at 7:30, and got a cabin for $7.14. The following morning, we drove across Bagnell Dam where we stopped at a roadside park, and Marine fixed breakfast. We got Cosby fever, and headed the Dodge north. We stopped in St. Joe for groceries, and still arrived home at 2 p.m. Looking back through the years, those were fun times, and I fondly cherish those memories. A fellow that lived in Cameron, Missouri, always stopped every evening at San Anton, on his way from work. He was in charge of the trucks for Tobin Construction, the company that was building Interstate 29. When completed, the highway would reach from Kansas City to the Canadian border. They had progressed as far north as Willowbrook, a little wide place in the road, a few miles to the south of St. Joe. One evening I asked him if he ever had any openings for drivers, and he said if I wanted to drive, that I would have to come down to the job site every morning, and if someone didn't show up for work, I could fill in for the day. I decided that I would give it a shot, because it paid good money. I showed up the following morning, but I don't recall whether I got to work that day or not, but I did it in some work, but not much. T was amazing that I had guts enough, or lacked intelligence enough to tackle the monster that I would be required to drive. It was a twin-screw L190 International, with a Humpteen gear transmission, and I knew that they were down in there somewhere, but didn't know how to locate them with those shifting levers. It had a steering wheel the size of a wagon wheel, and was equipped with an Armstrong power steering unit. In plain language there was none. It pulled a tandem axle dump trailer that seemed about a block long. I had never set foot in anything like it. The only trailer truck that I had ever driven was an old cab-over Ford, with a single-axle trailer, and an over and under transmission, that Bill Goff had owned. It had formerly been a car hauler, and had well over 1 million miles on it. I had an interesting experience with that over-the-hill rig that I feel compelled to relate to you. I had hauled a load of soybeans out of Nebraska, and was en route to the mill in South St. Joe. I had just came down the curved hill, where Pear Street joins Garfield Avenue, and stopped at 22nd Street, and proceeded on west on Garfield. As I approached the stop sign at 11th and Garfield, I touched my brake pedal and it proceeded on down to the floor. I had no brakes. I shifted down to a lower gear, and prepared to crash into whatever I could, to avoid running over anyone who might drive into the intersection. Lady Luck was with me, there was no one crossing the normally busy intersection. I coasted through, and proceeded on down to 10th Street, where I made a gentle turn and rolled to a stop. I used a nearby phone, and told Bill what had happened. He said, "Do you think you could ease it on down to South St. Joe, to the mill?" I replied not no, but hell no. I was elated that I could climb out of it, without having killed anyone. The first trip that I made, in the L190 International, was through downtown St. Joe, to the Pioneer Sand Company, located on the bank of the Missouri River. How I ever made those tight city street turns, without knocking down all the lampposts in town is more than I can understand. I had no idea where the gears were located on the shifter, I just fished for them. The base rock was stockpiled at Willowbrook, from there we hauled it out to the construction site. I was required to back it up to a machine, and put the truck in neutral, and the huge machine would push me, at a creeping speed, as I raised the mighty dump bed, laying the base for the new interstate highway. It was nothing short of a miracle, that I didn't tear the whole kit and caboodle to pieces. I didn't get much work at that job, but it is probably just as well that I didn't. It wasn't long, until word got to San Anton that a bridge was under construction at Stewartsville. Jimmy Wiedmeyer said, "Let's go over and see if we can get hired," so we headed out. We arrived on the east edge of the town, where the bridge was being built. It was on a secondary state highway that crossed the Castile Creek. We located the superintendent of the job, and asked him if he was needing some help. He said that he could use some, and led us over to a hole in the ground. It was about 8 foot square, and 10 foot deep, and the mud in the bottom appeared to be about knee deep. He said, "Are you boys afraid of mud?" Whereupon I replied, that while in Korea, I slept in it. Jimmy said he could also handle the mud, and the boss said, "Well, you're hired." I said, "When do you want us to start?" And he replied, "In the morning, at 7:30. The fellow's name was Al Niblack. He was about 35 years of age, and was a big rangy raw-boned guy. The following morning, we climbed down a ladder and into the mud. This particular job was simple. We spaded the mud from you and there the 1 by 1 by 12 foot beams, that were laid end to end in a square. We would continue to set beams on top of beams, and dig out from under, as the shored up walls sunk deeper into the pit. The crane operator could not see into the hole, so they had a signalman above it, directing him. The operator would set the clam bucket in the middle of the hole, and we shoveled the mud from under the beams, into the bucket. When it was full, the signalman would signal the operator to lift it out, and dump it. One day I was in the hole waiting for the return of the bucket, and wasn't looking up, when I should have been, and was putting way too much trust in the signalman and operator. When he got the bucket stopped, it was still springing up and down on the cable, just inches above my head. He had intended to drop it to the bottom, but set the brake when the man above us frantically signaled him to stop. The bucket probably weighed a half-ton, and would have driven me into the mud so deep, that they wouldn't have been able to unearth me, in order to rebury me. I had once again dodged the Grim Reaper. It was a hot and heavy job, but I sort of enjoyed watching such a large structure being created. And knowing that I had played a part in it. Al was a great guy to work for, but he had a quick temper. One day when something went wrong, he let his hammer fly, and let out a string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush, as the lethal tool went flying down across the deck, bouncing off the wooden forms, and finally coming to a halt out the other end of the bridge. I looked over at Big Al, who was standing there, grinning sort of sheepishly, and feeling a little embarrassed. He said, "I shouldn't have done that, should I?" We were working for the James Gould Construction Company, and the office was in Kansas City. The unions required that if a job was of a certain size, it required a certain number of carpenters, laborers, a crane operator, and an oiler. The oiler was a big overgrown feller, who laid in the shade of a tree most of the day and watched us work. He also made quite a bit more per hour than we laborers did. He didn't try to put on airs for anyone. He admitted that he was lazy and enjoyed his job a lot. He confessed to me one time, when he said, "I was born lazy." One day he was loafing down in the creek, where we had a pump setting. It weighed about 300 pounds, and we needed it back up on the bank. So I hollered to old Paul, asking him if he would put the hook into the eye on the pump, so the crane could lift it back up the hill. He was standing right beside it. He shouted back, "That's not an oiler's job, I can't." Noof said. I climbed down the bank, and slipped the hook into the eye. When we got to a certain part of the job, the union rules required that there were to be 2 more laborers, besides Jimmy and I. The St. Joe Union Local sent out 2 winners for Al to adopt. They were like machines, they had to be told when to move, and didn't know anything about bridge building. Needless to say, when that phase of the job was completed, Al sent them hiking in a hurry. After they were gone, he said, "Did you ever see anything like that pair?" Jimmy and I had never joined the union, and hadn't even thought about it. One day we were pouring a concrete end abutment, and I was up on top of the forms, running the concrete vibrator, when I heard someone yelling up at me, "Hey, come on down here." He was dressed up, in a clean shirt and dress trousers. I shouted back down, "I'm a little busy right now, I'll be down when this pour is completed." He didn't appear to be too happy with that news, and he was finding it a little warm in the hot sun, so he retreated to the shade of a nearby tree. When I finally got down and went over to him, he already had Jimmy cornered. His title was Union Business Agent, and he wanted to see our union cards. We informed him that we did not possess such a document, and he informed us that if we wanted to continue work, we would have to have one. I thought this was a strange practice, seeing as how Al had hired us, and he was the one that handed us our checks on payday. He told us that the job could be shut down if we did not comply. That left us no other choice, so he took us behind the tool trailer, and had us hold up our hand, and take an oath, which we did. I had my fingers crossed. His first official act that he performed for us, as our business agent, was to collect some money from us. This was the first and last time I would join one of these outfits. Jimmy and I got a stay on when the job was completed, and we helped move the equipment to the next job, down near the town of Plattsburgh. It was at about this time that I left my Dodge, at San Anton, for a grease job and oil change. I returned the following day, and as I scanned the parking area, I didn't see my car. I went inside, and asked Bill if my car was ready, and he said sure, it's setting out on the west side of the station. I said no it isn't. He replied you're kidding me? And I replied no I'm not. He thought that I was going to pick it up the evening before, and had hung the keys on the dashboard mounted shift lever, and someone needed my car worse than I did. I called the highway patrol, and reported it stolen, and drove the old Nash, a spare car that I had on hand, in case our good one was stolen. About a week later, at around midnight, I was awakened by a ringing phone. It was the police chief at Nevada, Missouri, and he asked if my car was stolen, and I replied in the affirmative. He said I have your car, and the kid that stole it, is in my jail, and you may pick it up here. I told him that I could come the following day. Someone took me there, but I don't recall who. It's 175 miles down there, and was about a 3-hour drive each way. When I arrived, my car was parked out in back, so I checked it over, and found that the trunk was empty, and my toolbox and spare tire was gone. The chief took me back into the jail, and sitting in a cell, was a 15-year-old kid. The kid told me that he was hitchhiking from his father's home in California, to his mother's on the East Coast. He had hitched a ride out of St. Joe as far as San Antone, where he was left when his ride ended. There. It was late at night and he didn't have a place to sleep, so he checked my car, and found the door unlocked, and climbed in to spend the night. To his surprise, he saw the keys hanging on the shift lever, and decided to borrow the car. I asked him where my tools were, and he told me where he sold each item, right there in Nevada. And to add insult to injury, he complained that he had to put some transmission oil in the car. And of course I replied that I was sure sorry about him having to do that. I guess I should have offered him a couple of dollars for the oil that he bought. The police CA chief took me around to the service stations, where he had sold my possessions, and I had to buy them back. All except my box of tools, and the man that the kid said bought them, said he didn't know anything about them. I was reasonably sure the fellow lied to me, because the boy had told me right on all the other things. He sold everything for just a few dollars for gas money. The policeman told me that the boy stopped in Nevada to visit his uncle who lived there. When he bid his uncle goodbye, he stopped at his car long enough to steal his license plates, and was in the process of changing them in front of a truck stop here in town, when an attendant saw him making the switch and called the law. They asked me if I would be willing to come back to press charges against him. Prior to this, he told me that the kid was in trouble with the law back at his home in California. I told him that I didn't want to make a return trip, and that the boy had plenty of problems already. If his folks had stayed together, he probably would not have been in trouble. I felt like they were more than likely the cause of him doing what he had done. I made it back home, but just barely. He had gutted my beautiful Dodge. It was running on 7 cylinders, and smoking. I also found a map in the compartment, and the markings on it indicated that he had probably been to Chicago, and back. I took what was left of it and traded it for a '56 Buick Roadster. Jimmy's brother Willie, who was a couple of years older than Jimmy, went to work on this job with us. Their sister Yvonne worked at the San Antone truck stop. Gilbert and Letha Wiedmeyer were the parents of 12 children, 8 boys, and 4 girls. Janet, Yvonne, Francis Frank, Wilford Willie, James Jimmy, Edwin Eddie, Nancy, Robert, Ronald, Gilbert, Diane, and Donald. Jimmy was a Democrat, a Catholic, and a Kennedy man. I of course was an ardent Republican and Nixon man, and a day seldom passed that we didn't have a lively political debate. Nixon and Kennedy were the first presidential candidates to have nationwide debates on television, and that seemed to keep people more focused on the race. Since May 17, 1954, when the Supreme Court had ordered that schools were to be integrated, there had been much racial unrest across the nation, and especially in the South. I will never forget the day that the thermometer was about to blow its top. It was about 110 in the shade, but there was no shade where we were. We built wooden forms that were about 3 feet square and 30 feet high. We then constructed the steel rebar that the crane would lift high above the forms and lower it snugly into them. These stems are what the bridge would rest on. Someone would be required to climb down into the stem, standing spraddle-legged, and using the outside edges of your shoe soles for footholds. To say that it was a precarious perch would be a huge understatement. No one wanted to go into the stem. It was so hot that they wanted to shut the job down for the day, but Al said we had to stay on schedule to get it completed on time. I told Al that I would do it, so I climbed a ladder and proceeded to make my way down into the stem. They lowered the trivet near the bottom with the crane, then lowered the vibrator down by hand. I held it by the long hose that supplied its power source. Up above, the crane operator swung a bucket of concrete out to the stem and dumped it into the funnel that was attached to the trivet. Just beneath my feet, I worked the donkey appendage, vibrator, up and down in the concrete, to prevent any air pockets from remaining in the mud. If any gaping holes were to appear when the forms were removed, the state would probably require us to destroy the stem and replace it, at a cost of thousands of dollars. After which my head would be handed back to me on a platter. This is one place you could not hide your mistakes. It would be a disaster of large proportions. When the cool concrete poured out beneath my feet, and forced the hot air up, it felt like I was a resident of Beelzebub's kitchen. Much of the time-consuming work went into the piling that was driven down to bedrock, and the concrete pads that the stems tied into. These things would remain covered with dirt and water, and invisible to the eye, but very important to the project. The deck and end abutment forms were made of wood, and took a great deal of time to complete. When the concrete for the deck was poured, the crane could not reach the center portion, and this was where we used the Georgia buggies. They were two-wheeled carts, with two automobile-type wheels. The device was well balanced, and therefore wasn't too heavy to lift. They would swing the crane out as far as it would reach, and dump a bucket of concrete into the Georgia buggy. We would then raise it from its rear legs, and balance it on the two wheels, and lay into it, to get it rolling. Once it was in motion, it was not easy to stop, seeing as how it had no brakes. To dump it, you simply raised up on the handlebar and it came gushing out onto the deck. You would then head back across the deck, meeting another one going the other direction. The present-day equipment is a far cry from what we used back then. To float the cement we used a mule float. It was a wooden device that spanned the width of the deck, and was equipped with plow handles on both ends. It had two long ropes attached to the ends, with a man on each rope, out in front of the poured concrete. They slowly pulled the float, while the two men on the plow handles pulled it rapidly back and forth, leveling the concrete. We would rotate from the easy of pulling the ropes to the killer job, working the plow handles. Occasionally when I was working the handles, they would have some fun with me. They would trade men off on the other end, trying to work me down, but I would accept the challenge and stay with it as long as they wanted to play the game. Needless to say, we stayed in pretty good physical condition. I worked with some good men. One of them was another rangy raw-boned carpenter from Plattsburgh, but he originally came from South Missouri, near the Arkansas border. His name was O.C. Conley. He was 52 years old, and was born at Blanche, Missouri, in 1908. He had the old southern Missouri drawl, and I suppose you might say that he was an old hillbilly. He used to tell me stories about living on an old rocky, hilly knob, scratching out a living on the 40 acres, with a team of mules. He also said that the corn he raised was not always ate by the farm animals. They sometimes would cook it in a still, and make an adult beverage called White Lightning. He also told me that all of the people in his community would attend a barn dance every Saturday night. O.C. was skilled at playing the fiddle, and entertained a lot back in the old days. He had been married and divorced, and was the father of 4 grown children, a boy and 3 girls. He had served in the Army during World War II. He was quite a character. He had a pickup with a camper on it. He always carried his squirrel rifle, and on our noon break, He would walk down the creek and shoot a young squirrel. The next day he would have fried squirrel sandwiches for lunch. He lived alone and did his own cooking. 25 years later, during the construction of the new Missouri River Bridge at St. Joe, he would work far below the water of the surging river, in a large steel, open-top tank, building the foundation for the mighty bridge to rest on. At the time, he was well into his 70s. The bridge was completed that fall, so I bid Jimmy, Al, O.C., Leon, and Schaffer and the other boys farewell, and prepared to launch my new career into the barber profession. Jimmy found his niche in the heavy construction work, but it was probably the biggest mistake of his life. But it was probably the biggest mistake of his life. But it was probably the biggest mistake of his life. But it was probably the biggest